Welcome to a special Safelite Skate Space here on the day after the regular season. The Blue Jackets firing head coach Brad Larson and not renewing the contract of the goaltending coach Manny Legacy. It was announced early this morning that that is the case. Jarmo Kekalainen just got done talking to the media just a few moments ago about these very things, and now we are going to talk with you about it. So if you have any questions, anything you'd like to say, you can just request to be a speaker. We'll bring you up, and you can do that. But first, let's get the opening statement from Jarmo Kekalainen in the press conference just a few minutes ago.
It's an unfortunate situation for all of us. And, we do our evaluation every day here. We watch every practice. We watch try to watch closely what's going on in the locker room, and we're communicating with the coaches every day, and that's how we do our evaluations on what goes on with our team, and especially the direction we want to take with our team. And we came to the conclusion that this was absolutely a necessary change that we needed to make, and that's why we're here today.
Jarmo Kekalainen, Blue Jackets general manager, talking about the day-to-day evaluation of his team and that he felt this coaching change was necessary right now. I am joined by Tyrer and Jeff Svoboda, the Jackets insider, right now. And, guys, your reaction. I think we all kind of were wondering last night, we were definitely wondering last night after Brad Larson's post-game press conference, his demeanor, his tone, the things he said, the way that they said him really gave you the idea that this might be it for him. And it turns out this morning that it is. Dylan, I'll start with you. Thoughts on this change coming at this time?
I think it's just a culture thing, right? The point of the transition from John Tortorella to Brad Larson a couple of years ago, they talked about it being kind of a continuation, some of the same ideas, the same ideals, the same culture in that dressing room, and I think the Blue Jackets kind of got away from that. You always talk about that you don't want to accept losing, you don't want it to become the norm. Well, a lot of things happened for the Columbus Blue Jackets this season where it was hard to avoid losing, but there was kind of a feel in that room that it had become the norm, so I think you just need to start new, and there are hungry veterans in that room that are sick of losing, right? You just have to make a change to get this thing back on the rails, back on track, however you want to put it, and to me, it comes down to that. It's not necessarily X's and O's or anything like that. I think the Blue Jackets just need a little bit more structure, rigidity in that room, like John Tortorella did provide. I think they just got away from that.
And my thought is just, I'm curious as to when the decision was made, because just listening to Jarmo Kekalainen, I think it kind of points to what Dylan Tyrer said as far as culture. It felt like Jarmo had made this decision a while back. Like, this was not something they came to the conclusion of last night. Just listening to him talk, it seemed to me that he really felt as though changes were necessary. I mean, he used the word necessary a number of times as far as this has to go in a different direction. And so he said that, the evaluation would not be on wins and losses, especially because of all the injuries they had this year. And so if it wasn't on wins and losses, that meant other things were at play. And if they still felt they had to make a change, that means that it felt like they really had to get this thing going a different direction, whatever it be, culture, whatever it is. I think there was frustration with where this was headed, and it sounds as though dramatic action was necessary in what they wanted. So,
yeah, that's an interesting point by you in bringing that up, that it did kind of have that feeling that this had been something that was coming for a while. Jarmo Kekalainen and those guys had talked about it, decided on it, and then just kind of played out the season. So he wouldn't get into the specifics with the timeline or anything like that out of respect for the coaching staff, which I absolutely understand, but it would be interesting to be a fly on the wall in some of those meetings and figure out when they did come to that decision this year, because it's pretty interesting if they came to it relatively early in the year or halfway through the year, because it didn't necessarily sound like it came down to the wire or anything like that. So what the specific reasons were, maybe some examples of what they thought was wrong, it'll definitely be addressed, and we'll figure it out quickly with whoever they hire next, because I guarantee you it'll be somebody that does all the things that they're looking for.
All right, again, if you'd like to comment on this, you have any questions about the situation, if you're with us on Twitter Spaces right now, all you have to do is request to be a speaker, and we'll bring you on. Right now, I would like to bring on Jeff Rimmer, who's the television voice of the Blue Jackets. And Jeff, first of all, your thoughts. I mean, this is something we've speculated, talked about for a while to try to figure out what was going to happen here, and today we find out.
Well, I can't say I'm surprised, and obviously questions have been asked of General Manager Jarmo Kekalainen as to would there be a coaching change. And of course, over the course of the last few weeks, he indicated if there's a coaching change, it won't be necessarily because of wins and losses. But looking back on it, I really believe that management, and specifically Yarmo, felt that a change needed to be made specifically because I think that there has to be some accountability. And I wonder about the accountability, and I'm not going to get into naming names, but you can just look at the hockey team and in particular certain players that maybe could have performed better, didn't perform better, and there were side issues, etc. And I think it just came to the final conclusion of the organization that a change needed to be made.
You know, Jeff, we were just talking about just wondering when the decision came, if it was recent, if it was a while ago. And, you know, as Dylan and Jeff were talking about that, I was just running through my mind at different points during the season. And the one point that jumps out to me is that Buffalo game that happened here at Nationwide Arena the night that Tage Thompson had the 5 goals in the game. And I think it was that night there was extra time before Brad Larson came out for his press conference. I'm not saying it was just one event, but I think it's kind of what you were talking about, right? It was just kind of a build-up of events and performances, and it may not be totally on wins and losses, but probably in some of those losses and the way those losses went down, I would imagine factored into some of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can look back on any number of games. It was interesting that on more than one occasion here in the press conference this morning, Yarmo indicated they watch everything. They watch what goes on in the room amongst the players. They obviously watch practices. And I think that in some cases we watch practices, you and I, Bob, and certainly Dylan and Jeff, and certain things aren't happening in practices that perhaps need to be done during practices. And I think that too was part of the evaluation in a big way. And I think that perhaps the Jackets' practice purposes weren't necessarily the way that management and obviously senior management wanted to see. They didn't like what they were seeing.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I'll be like you, Jeff. I'm not going to name names, but somebody said to me throughout the course of the year that when you compared last year's training camp to this year's training camp, when you compared last year's practices to this year's practices, that it didn't seem like they were as hard this year as they were last year. And when you're coming off the Tortorella era and everything is hard, and you go into a new era and you're trying to extend that and everything is hard, and then you overachieve and you have a good season, I guess the question would be, why would you ever back it down? I mean, I know your personnel has changed. I get that. You're playing with a lot of young kids, but that to me is even more of a reason to crank it up. I mean, don't back it off because these kids have got to learn what it's going to take to play in the NHL.
That's a good point. And remember what Brad Larson always talked about. It was raising the standard. That's what he talked about at the end of last season, was that we need to raise the standard. At the beginning of this season, it was we need to raise the standard. And that just didn't happen for the Columbus Blue Jackets this season. And it's in the habits that Jeff Rimmer is talking about. I think the practices for the Blue Jackets weren't as crisp this season. How many times did we say Brad Larson say, come on, guys, let's pick it up. We need to do this better at practice. It's something that I wasn't really used to seeing with the Blue Jackets. How many times did Torts have to talk to the guys and tell them to, liven up at practice? Or how many times did Brad Larson have to do that last year? It's going back to that culture thing where you just kind of get in that rhythm of losing games and you're losing players to injury. There wasn't necessarily, that fire and that tenacity, and going back to what you said, Bob, and what I started with, the rigidity of what the Blue Jackets had grown used to with John Tortorella.
And I think some of that may have to do with, you're disappointed when you have so many players.
Right.
You're disappointed when you know your season's over in November. I totally get that. But Jeff Rimmer, look at the Chicago Blackhawks and what Luke Richardson did there with the team. There was never an excuse. They knew they were going to be bad going into it. They continually got better from beginning to end. And, I just look at that as an example of what Dylan was just talking about with that structure and that, just this is the way we are as an organization. And it did seem to slip.
There's no question it did. And I want to say this first and foremost. Brad Larson is a terrific person.
Yep.
And I think he maybe, in retrospect, we know, and you talked about John Tortorella a few moments ago, we know that the coaching relationship between Tortorella and his players at times got pretty nasty. And specifically, he went after certain players that he didn't think were performing up to capabilities, not only in games, but in practice. And I think that Brad Larson perhaps was, for lack of a better word, too nice to some of these players that, again, we're not going to name, and he didn't get the maximum effort, nor I go to that accountability again. The accountability wasn't there, and the bottom line is certainly management was aware of that, just watching, excuse me, the performance on the ice or during practice especially. And again, that's something that Yarmo hit on a couple of times in the press conference, and that is they evaluated every practice.
Yeah, and before we get some listeners on, which we're going to do in just a second, I want to ask Jeff Svoboda, what Jeff just said about Brad Larson. He is a great human being. He's a quality human being, and that's what gets lost in all these firings. Manny Legacy, look, he's a good friend of mine. I'll miss having this guy around, but I get it. It's a business. You know, your guys aren't performing. You're tied to those guys. This is what happens in professional sports. I understand all of that. So let's not get lost in the fact that these are two good people that were doing a good job for this organization for a long time in the American Hockey League and then in the National Hockey League. But that being said, it would be very easy to go back and say, well, you know, this lasted only 2 years. Why did you do this to begin with when Tortorella left? But at the time, it was the right decision. You had a team that was going into a development mode. You had a coach that was a development coach, and it made sense, and that's why they did what they did. And it worked last year. And this year, it didn't work. But even saying that, you're coming out a little bit. You're coming out of that development phase here. Kent Johnson finishes the year with 40 points. He had a good year. He got better as it went along. Kirill Marchenko finished with the 21 goals. Those were two guys that Yarmo pointed out in the press conference. It's time to take another step. And so what made sense 2 years ago just doesn't necessarily make sense right now.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you just said, and I'll start by reiterating your point about them being two fantastic human beings, and that it is something that does occasionally get lost in these types of things. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. And you think about Brad Larson being here. He was hired in this organization in 2010 to work down in Springfield. Has been with the NHL team since 2014. That doesn't happen a ton in the NHL. And so I think that speaks to, him being both a good coach and a good person for him to be here as long as he was. But it also speaks to that eventually changes have to be made. And in this situation, I agree that when, Tortorella leaves and you're in a situation where you feel like you've got a young team, a reset happening, you wanted someone that you felt comfortable having the ability to work with young players, and Brad Larson had done that down in Cleveland and had some success as well, Springfield at the time, but down at the AHL level. But I do agree
where you really had a coach, because that place is a dump.
Yeah,
like if you're in Cleveland, is one thing. Springfield's a dump. Sorry, go ahead.
I can only imagine. So they knew he had some success in that way, and as you look at it last year, you would have felt like this was a pretty strong move. But this was a year where everything that felt like it could go wrong did go wrong. But Brad Larson talked all season about you're making evaluations as how do people handle those situations when things are going wrong. It sounds like Jarmo Kekalainen was doing the same thing with Brad Larson, and the evaluation was, we need this to go a different direction. And I do agree that you're at a point now where some of these players are starting to get older, and we've seen so many young players play these last couple of years, and you've gotten some positive evaluations. I think you've probably gotten some negative evaluations on some of these guys. I think this is now the situation where you're going to start making decisions on some of these guys. You're going to really start consolidating this into the team you think is going to be your next good team, and you want that coach that's going to be the coach that's going to take that team to the next level.
Absolutely right. And again, Yarmo has said numerous times he doesn't want this to be the youngest team in the league anymore.
Yeah.
Right? And it can't be. It can't be if you want to win. Mr. Union Blue is first up to ask a question or make a comment, whatever you want to do, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Definitely a bit of a shocker for this to happen this morning. I don't know if really many of us were expecting this to happen the day after the regular season ended, but some of the points that you guys brought up kind of brought a question to my mind, and that's what changed in between this season and last season, especially compared to the training camp and the way that we were talking about how practices weren't quite as intense. I mean, it seemed like last year we had a lot of great success. Everybody was well prepared for the season, but coming into this year, just like you all said, it really didn't see that same level of preparedness, and it really did impact the team's performance. Did we see something change from the coaching philosophy? I just really don't understand the departure from that between one season to the next.
Jeff Rimmer, you want to attack that?
Yeah, I'll attack it, and it's really, really simple. All right. Brad Larson, again, we talked about the quality that he has. I think he was too light on the players. I'm not saying you need John Tortorella 2.0, but I think something after last year's success and the team, as discussed here earlier, overachieved. I think Brad gave the players a little more rope. And some players took advantage of that. And plain and simple, that's what I believe led management to want to make a change, because Brad got a little bit too close to some of these players and maybe wasn't holding them accountable the way they needed to be held accountable. And you can look around the team and you can pretty well judge, without naming names, who needed to be a little more accountable and who he needed to be a little more accountable to.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that, adding Johnny Gaudreau made a difference too, I think, because it kind of changed things. Everybody got a little bit ahead of themselves this year. And, I think the team, everybody started anticipating things that, quite frankly, they weren't ready to heights they weren't ready to reach yet.
I was going to bring something similar to that up because I want to ask you guys and talk about it a little bit. It's like, you think about how the Blue Jackets finished last year. They probably overachieved, but the fans, the players, everybody thought the Blue Jackets would be a more competitive team this season because everybody thinks on an upward trajectory, right? You want to be hopeful. And then you sign Johnny Gaudreau, and you make some other moves, and you have Kent Johnson, you've got Kirill Marchenko coming over from the KHL. You're like, okay, the Blue Jackets could make some noise this season. Elvis Merzlikins is going to be the Blue Jackets' #1 this year with his big contract, everything like that. And then the season starts the way it did, where you lose some games, it's a tough start, then guys start to get hurt, and then that kind of brings you to the point in the season where it's like, okay, it's going to go one way or it's going to go the other way. We're either going to show some backbone, show some spine here, and finish strong, or it's going to go downhill. And, it goes back to the accountability that Jeff Rimmer's talked about a little bit, and it also goes to that December 7th game against the Buffalo Sabres, I think, where you look at maybe that's the point in the season where, okay, we're going to put our foot in the ground and say we're going up from here, or we're going to go the other direction. And the Blue Jackets lose on national TV in that game. Remember, it was on TNT. And then the season...
I've tried to forget everything about that game, by the way.
And then the season goes downhill in the other direction from there, where things start to snowball. And I think all of this kind of comes together, and it just goes back to the culture thing that we're talking about. Things just got a little bit too loose. Things snowballed. Everybody kind of accepted the failure as the season went on. And, there are specific players in that room that want to win, like I said earlier. Nobody wants to accept failure. But when you're just in this endless cycle of losing players, losing games, losing more players, losing games, there's nowhere to gain a foothold, and I think that's just what happened. Like, I just feel like that's what happened.
Well, I remember a year ago on this day, I asked Brad Larson on the exit interview day about, last year exceeded expectations. And I think everybody, and this is even before Johnny Gaudreau, but you think, oh, this team was better than we thought.
Yes.
Next year, they're young, they're going to get better.
It's the natural way to think.
Yeah, I remember us talking on Skate Space at the end of last year. Is this a playoff team next year?
Yeah.
And you start thinking about that going there. But I've been around sports long enough. These things don't go on a linear path. Sometimes there's fits and starts. They go up and down a little bit. And I asked Brad Larson, they're probably going to face some adversity next year. You didn't face this year. How important is it that you guys are going to be able to handle that? And he talked at length about he said the same thing. These things don't follow, the straight line. There's going to be ups and downs. We're going to have to be able to handle that, things like that. So he knew kind of some of this. Now, who could have predicted 500 some man games lost to injuries, et cetera, et cetera. But the big test of the season, I thought, was going to be, how are they going to handle that success and keep it going in the right direction? And let's be honest, it was a tremendous failure.
Yeah.
Even though they knew it was coming, they were dealt the adversity, and what team would have survived this adversity? But I think there are teams who could have handled it better, and it went the wrong way.
Yeah, we don't know what it was, but there are specific things in handling that adversity that management didn't like. That's the difference in it all, right?
Players,
that's what we're talking about.
Guys, players need to be challenged. Players need to be pushed. If I can make an example here, and it's
are you going to name names yet?
Yeah, he's like Ned Isikoff here at Seinfeld.
I've named John Tortorella. Now I'm going to name a player that John Tortorella coached. Okay, players, and this was a perfect example of players needing to be pushed. And maybe some of the players on this current roster, regardless of the injuries, needed to be pushed. And an example I'm going to give you, and I know you guys are going to agree, he's no longer here, and that's a bitter pill to swallow for a lot of Blue Jacket fans. But Oliver Bjorkstrand, John Tortorella pushed Oliver Bjorkstrand to the end. Hey, the guy's a great player, don't get me wrong. But he continually pushed him to the point where I think John Tortorella was as much responsible for Bjorkstrand's development simply because he pushed him and he got him that contract, 5 years, $5 million, which ultimately cost him his job with the Blue Jackets when Gaudreau came. But it's that example of pushing a player. And there are other players on this Blue Jackets team that you guys all know that just did not achieve what was expected from them. And they weren't pushed as a result by the coach. And I think that's what ultimately cost him his job.
I think that's a great point bringing up Oliver Bjorkstrand there because he always had the opportunity to be a good player. You know, he's a third-round pick by the Blue Jackets, had big junior numbers. And he's also a nice guy. You know, like he shows up with the Blue Jackets. You're like, okay, here's this nice guy, Oliver Bjorkstrand. We'll just let him play and figure it out. But Torts pushed him. Like, I love Jeff bringing that up, that Torts it was tough love with Oliver Bjorkstrand, and he brought him to that other level. And, you know, I think you can bring it up with a player like Pierre-Luc Dubois, where maybe it didn't work out as well between those two. But
it did.
But yes.
It worked out for his career.
Yes, exactly. When Pierre-Luc Dubois was playing angry, he was at his best, and Torts brought that out of him. So I think that's a terrific point brought up by Rimmer there.
Well, it is very interesting. There's a narrative out there that Torts was terrible for young players. And I think if you look at the young players that thrived under his leadership, that's a total fallacy. Mm-hmm. And Oliver Bjorkstrand being on that list, you know, think of guys like Josh Anderson, who was a fourth-round pick.
Cam Atkinson at times.
Cam Atkinson was a sixth. You know, all these guys who were probably overachieved in their careers because of that tough love of John Tortorella. And Brad Larson was hired to sort of continue that culture and being a development guy, because we talked about how young this team was. And I think you can point to Kirill Marchenko had a great year. Ken Johnson had a very good year, but I honestly don't know how good Brad Larson was as a development coach. And that's something we'll figure out down the road. Torts had 6 years, and the proof's in the pudding there. Brad only had 2. But I just don't know the answer. I don't know how he pushed those guys. He talked about doing it and talked about video sessions and conversations, things like that. But I know the Tortorella method worked, and I also know that they're going to need a coach that's going to have that ability to keep bringing along young guys as they go forward, and that maybe links us to another point of discussion as to where this whole thing goes now.
Well, hold on. We got a lot of people that want to come on this show.
Right. I know. Yeah, I'm not host. I tried to take over as host, Bob. I'm sorry.
Let's be quiet. Let's be quiet. Let these people talk.
Calm down. Just a second. Dave has been waiting patiently. Hello, Dave. Welcome to the show.
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to call in and say the primary goal of this season supposedly was to make the playoffs, but the secondary and maybe more achievable goal was to create a defensive system for this team. And obviously with the 6 guys on the back, it was pretty much a rotating turnstile of players who came in and really gave it their all. But there's more to it than just those 6 guys. And then the management change today would indicate that objective was a failure for the season. I wanted to see if you guys would agree with that statement, or how you felt that the defensive system between last season and this season maybe changed, and we could look forward to next season on building upon that.
Look, when Zach Werenski goes out 2 weeks into the season, your plan is out the window.
Yeah, I just don't feel like we ever got the opportunity for it to be fully put in place.
Look, you had Werenski's out for the year, 2 to 3 weeks in. Jake Bean's out a week later for the entire year. Adam Boquist is out for 8 weeks, and Nick Blankenberg is out for 8 weeks. All of that happens in the first month. So you have 4 of the 6 guys that you started on opening night that are done long-term, 2 of them for the entire season. So all of that was gone. Like the defense, it wasn't that strong at the beginning, and then it was completely weakened after all of that happened. So as far as a defensive system, you know, you really didn't have much of a chance at it. But I will say this, and I do mean this, and we've talked about this. Look, the goaltending has something's got to happen there with the goaltending. Elvis Merzlikins, this is now 2 years of struggle. The first one under the first year of this big contract. I don't know how they're going to fix it. I don't know if they can get him straightened out. I don't know if they can move his contract. But, you know, you can have all the defensive systems in the world, and it helps the goaltender, but then the goaltender has to be able to stop a puck.
It is a funny thing, right? Because when a goalie has a good season, or like when Sergei Bobrovsky had Vezina caliber seasons with the Blue Jackets, everybody's like, well, yeah, John Tortorella's defensive system was in front of him, though. And now it's like, well, the Blue Jackets have bad defense, so it's okay when the goalies don't make the saves. It is funny how that works. But the goalies have to be better. And when it comes down to it, like, yeah, systems matter, but the players are the ones playing the games. Like, you need good players to execute. It doesn't matter what the system is. If you don't have the guys out there to do it, it's not going to work.
All right, Little Boomer. Little Boomer's up next.
Morning, gentlemen. I'm just going to leave it at morning instead of good because we don't know yet. We'll find out in a year or two. But
It's not going to take that long.
well, we'll find out. But with the last coaching search when they hired Larson, it seemed like they only interviewed 3 or 4 people. Is it going to be a little more in depth? And I know you've talked about it on your show, Bobby, that with Tortorella, he has a shelf life, and we probably kept him a year longer. Now, COVID had something to play in that. So with this next hire, how much longer is Yarmo's rope before they start looking at the front office?
Well,
you guys want to get off here and listen.
All right. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, well, and he was kind of asked that this morning. Aaron Portzline asked him that there. And after the coaches go, the GM comes into the spotlight. But I'm not even worried about that right now. But Jeff Rimmer, like he just said, they only looked at 2 or 3 guys. We have no idea how many guys that they looked at. They're not going to tell you, hey, we talked to 15 people before we hired Brad Larson for this job. So we have no idea what's going on there. And I think Jeff Svoboda was trying to start this. What direction are they going now? And Jeff Rimmer, I'll ask you this. Pascal Vincent's a good guy. He's been here 2 years. He's been the assistant coach. He came from outside the organization. I think now they do have to go outside the organization. Does he qualify as being an outsider, even though he's been here the last couple of years?
No, I think he is, and that was indicated very clearly by Yarmo. He said it on more than one occasion this morning that they'll also look internally for the successor here to Brad Larson. Hey, we don't know, as you said, how many people were interviewed, how many prospective coaches the Blue Jackets actually interviewed in their last search. But understand one thing, and they did meet with a number of coaches, and they kept coming back to Brad Larson. They felt that Brad Larson, he was prepared for his interview. He was interviewed, from what I understand, more than a couple of times, and they just felt that at the time and where the team was, he was the perfect candidate for the coach. They talked to several others. I know for a fact of a few people, including Gerard Gallant, who eventually got the New York Ranger job. And quite frankly, I'm pretty close to Gerard. He, for the longest time, even though the Rangers were out there lurking, he really was attracted to the Columbus job. I think had the team been further along in their development, and remember, this is before Johnny Gaudreau arrived, he might have been more of a serious candidate. Eventually got the Ranger job, and he's now getting ready to play against the New York or the New Jersey Devils in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. But, they did an extensive search. How many people they actually brought in and interviewed, I don't know. But they did talk to Brad Larson on a couple of occasions. And the more they talked to Brad, they liked what his game plan was. And, of course, he was there under John Tortorella and had a pretty good handle on what needed to be done moving forward. And again, I think he excelled in that first season. But because of the success they had in the first season, I think it really hurt him in year 2.
Could Gerard Gallant get fired if they lose to the Devils and be available?
I think he could possibly be available, yeah. I mean, that owner there is a wingnut, as everybody knows. Jim Dolan, I know earlier on this season, there was talk that Gerard could be moved. Gerard was certainly not very happy the way things were going, and there were all kinds of rumors that a coaching change there was imminent. They turned things around, and they're now going to face they're really, for lack of a better word, they're crosstown rivals, and that's going to be a great series to watch. One of the many first-round series I'm looking forward to watch. Unfortunately, the Blue Jackets aren't one of the teams in a series. But, yeah, to answer your question bluntly, I think there's that possibility for sure.
You're going to be torn during that series. You got Gerard Gallant on one side. I know you're close with Lindy Ruff on the other side, and Tom Fitzgerald, who's the GM for the Devils. What are you going to do, Jeff?
I'm just going to sit back and watch.
Should be an entertaining series, so that shouldn't be hard.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. All right, let's go back to the listeners here who have something to say, and let's get connected up. Got a couple of people. This is popular today, which is good. The Saturday morning, day after the season ends, Donald is next up on the show. Hello, Donald.
Hey, thanks for having me on. And it's the end of the year, that's for sure. But I wanted to get into talk around goalie coach and Manny. And I can't say it wasn't time to make a change, but I guess is this a situation where the next coach is going to bring in his goalie guy? What are we looking at here?
Now
That's an organizational. That's
yeah,
an organizational decision. I think that's up to Jarmo Kekalainen and the rest of the management staff. Certainly, a new coach potentially could have input, although they may even hire the new goalie coach before. And quite frankly, you want my bottom line feeling on it? I think they've got to get a goalie coach in here as soon as possible, and it's got to be one that's going to hold. We talk about tough love and being accountable. They're going to have a goalie coach that's accountable and has the players accountable to him, and most notably Elvis Merzlikins.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Jeff Svoboda, I think that is one. Look, with Elvis, we've talked about, I know he's been hurt a lot, but it just seems, outside looking in, sitting upstairs and looking downstairs, there is a lot of this that is internal between the ears as much as there is between the pipes with him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you know Elvis, he lives between his ears. I mean, there's a lot going on in his brain, and I think a lot of it is good, and I think it can also cause him trouble because of goalie is a position where sometimes thinking is the enemy. You just have to go out there and play and trust your instincts, and I think it's been clear at times the last couple of years as some of the struggles have mounted. He has gotten a little bit too deep in his own head, but I've also said this a million times, goaltending is weird. I mean, Jonas Korpisalo had the year from hell last year, and he had injuries, he had illnesses, he had ineffectiveness, he finally got healthy in the offseason, came in different outlook, different mentality, and now he's one of the best goalies in the league right now, about to start for a playoff team. So, I have the thought that, I'm not going to give up on Elvis Merzlikins yet because this position is one of the weirdest positions in sports, and it fluctuates from year to year, but there's no question that he has to be a better goalie going forward. You cannot post the numbers that he's posted the last couple of years, and say what you will about the defense and all the things that have happened, but it's in a results business. He's going to have to be a better player. Do I think it's in him? I do. It's going to have to be consistent, though. It's going to have to be something that we see on a regular basis. And so there's a question mark there. And especially as you go into even down the line, Daniil Tarasov, the injuries he's had going forward. I mean, the biggest question mark to me with this team going forward is, I like the young talent in so many positions, especially, we saw young forwards this year. There's young defensemen coming. You've got veterans. You've got a lot of things I like still about this team despite this season, but the question mark is goaltending. It's a huge, huge question mark in my opinion. And so the goalie coach becomes a very important hire in that situation.
Yeah, let me cut through, I believe, what Jeff Rimmer was saying here, Dylan. I think what we're all talking about is the Blue Jackets need more of a hard-ass goalie coach.
Yeah, I'm very, very curious to hear what you guys think about this because it might be a little bit out there, but this popped into my brain. A lot of teams around the league, well, I won't say a lot, but a few teams around the league have really built out goaltending departments with like a high-up goalie guy and then a few consultants, coaches. Like, could the Blue Jackets go in that direction if you really want to get things going? Because as it stands right now, the Blue Jackets have some guys in the pipeline, but you could really build out a goalie pipeline and have some more hardcore coaching. But like you said, I think that's where it starts. Yeah, you got to go back to like it all starts with the rigidity that I started with. I think the Blue Jackets just need more. I don't want to use the word backbone because I think Brad Larson had a lot of integrity in his coaching staff, but up and down, I think there just needs to be more backbone. Accountability is the word. Rimmer's talked about it already. It's accountability, but I would be curious to see if they'd be willing to maybe build out that goaltending department to make sure that there aren't any leaks or anything like that. That they're airtight when it comes to development, when it comes to selecting goaltenders to make it in the NHL in the future. You know what I mean? Like just as many voices as you have and as many voices as you trust to help make decisions.
Yeah, Jeff Rimmer, I think if you look at the Florida Panthers, what Bill Zito did down there, he took Roberto Luongo and he put him in charge of goaltending of a department like Dylan's talking about right now. I think that's very possible here, and I think a guy maybe like Nicholas Backstrom, who is in the organization already and has been overseeing the goalies that are over in Europe right now, he might be a guy. He played in the NHL for a long time. That might be a guy that could head up something like that. And then you can get your, a guy that works with the European guys underneath him, a guy that works with the NHL goalies underneath him, and then whoever you have, whether it's Brad Thiessen or if they make a change in Cleveland, all three of those guys kind of reporting to him. That does seem to be a direction teams are going in right now.
Oh, yeah, there's no question. You mentioned Thiessen there and obviously Backstrom over in Europe. But for me, if I was making the hire, if I was the general manager, I would hire one person to deal with the team here at the NHL level. And that person, you guys use the expression a hard ass. That's what Elvis needs. He needs some tough love here now. And I'm sure that that is going to be a hire made by Blue Jackets management and with a lot of thought and consideration for sure.
You know any guys like that?
I'm just thinking off the top of my
Besides
head
Ian
here.
Clark, because that's what he was when he was here.
Well, hey, you can say everything you want about Ian Clark, and his ego is big as Nationwide Arena, but the guy is a terrific goaltending coach, and he's also a terrific goaltending scout. And as it turned out, I asked him when we were in Vancouver, and I think you were right there with us, Bob. Certainly Jody was there. And I asked him, I said, what's with Elvis? And I'm being blunt here now. He said, without hesitation, you can't be friends with your goaltender. It's got to be a coach-player relationship, and that says it all.
Yeah, I was there when he said that, and I was also there when he said that his wife is bugging him to move back to Columbus too. So we'll see what happens with that. I don't know what's going on in Vancouver with him. I mean, I think he has a contract there, but who knows? What were you going to say, Jeff?
So you finally got Rimmer to name names by naming the name for him.
No, he named Bjorkstrand before.
Yeah, that was an easy one.
Rimmer, stand up for yourself here. Come on, take this guy on.
Oh, you're doing a good job. I'm just sitting back here and listening.
All right, Eric is up next on today's special Skate Space as the Blue Jackets have parted ways with their head coach, Brad Larson. So, Eric, go ahead and unmute, and you can come on the show. We've got Eric and then two more before we wrap things up. Hello, Eric.
Hello, thank you. So obviously, I'm from Finland, and like following Blue Jackets when there's Patrick Laine and guys, and now when the head coach isn't there anymore, what do you think about the next head coach? Is gonna be? Is there a possibility about European head coach or maybe coach in the coaching team? And what I mean is 2 weeks ago in a podcast hosted by Antti Mäkinen and Kimmo Timonen, Jukka Jalonen, the Finnish head coach, was guest in the podcast, and what he said, he is open to any offers on the NHL teams and coaching teams. So, what do you think are Blue Jackets going with head coach from the USA, or are they open to possibilities from the European side?
Well, Eric, thank you for that. Really appreciate it. I think they're open to anything at this point in time. I really do. I think it's wide open for anybody. Jeff Svoboda, you're the insider. What do you think about this? And especially in no surprise that the Finnish coach is being asked about, with Jarmo being Finnish, and with a guy that's had a lot of success, the World Juniors, the Olympics, and all that stuff.
Well, as you said, I think no doors are closed because I think you'd be stupid to close any doors right now. You have a brand new coaching search. You want to listen to every probably voice that you have in that situation. Do I think they would go that route? If it's the right guy, do I think they will go that route? I do not think they will go that route. I think with the situation that you just had with a first-time NHL head coach, and I know it's probably a little bit different with a guy who has extensive experience, kind of coaching over the European level, the pro level, and all that things. That guy will have a little bit more experience being a head coach than Brad Larson has. But I think you showed this situation these past couple of years that it's hard to be a first-time NHL head coach. There's so many things you have to learn. There's so many things you have to do differently. Brad Larson had been here for, as I said, for a long time in this organization, and I still think he was a little bit overwhelmed and taken aback at times by all the things you have to do as a head coach. I think that puts the Blue Jackets in a situation where you want somebody with a little bit more experience, and so I think that's the route they're going to go. But I think you'd be dumb not to listen to all the options out there. To be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about Jukka Jalonen and the coaching style, or if he is a hard ass, I guess is the word that we've been using for lack of a better term. I'm sure you look into it, right? I agree with Jeff. I think you hire an established NHL head coach, a guy that's been there before. Just look around. I mean, there are names available, right? You might not like to hear them, but a Claude Julien, Mike Babcock, Peter Laviolette just got let go. I mean, there are names out there that have been established in this league before, right? So I think the Blue Jackets go in that direction. That's the direction I would go if I were hiring. I wouldn't want another first-time NHL head coach.
Yeah, hey, Jeff Rimmer, whenever this comes up, and I know this is not fair, so let me put that out there immediately. But when I think about European coaches, Ivan Hlinka always comes into my mind when Craig Patrick brought him into Pittsburgh. And I talked with Craig about that years later. And, of course, he had Jágr there, and that was a big deal. But and this wouldn't be the case with a Finnish coach. But, Hlinka had a language barrier. That was a major thing. Plus, he was a first-time coach in the National Hockey League. But Jeff, I'll ask you that, too. Coming over from Europe, we always talk about the players having to make the adjustments. A coach would have to do that too. And if you feel like you're in a mode where it's time now to start going beyond development and going into winning, I don't know if that's the path you're going to take right away.
Well, I've got two schools of thought on that. Number one, I agree with everything you've said, but let me just throw this caveat. The Blue Jackets, in fact, I wouldn't say have the most, but there's a number of European players on the Blue Jackets hockey team. Would that perhaps be a factor that might have an inclination for the Jackets to look that way? I say that, but the bottom line here is I think the management, and specifically Jarmo Kekalainen, is going to leave no stone unturned here. This is an important hire. And as you guys discussed just as I was coming on the air, this might be Jarmo's last hire. So, hey, you want to make it the right one. And that's why I think there'll be a lot of thought going into this. And that could or could not help perhaps a European coach getting a first opportunity in the National Hockey League, at least with the Blue Jackets at this time.
Let's welcome Chris to today's show, the Safelite Skate Space, talking about the Blue Jackets making a head coaching change today. Hello, Chris.
Hello. First off, thank you guys for all your hard work throughout the obviously disappointing season, but still,
we thought we had the day off today, Chris. You know that?
I can imagine.
I'm kidding.
I know, all the injuries was kind of a freak season, but do you see, especially since, the team spent all this money upgrading, we got all the state-of-the-art new facilities and everything, any big changes to, off-season workouts, how they're going to go about that for, training and development during the off-season with the players?
That's something else that they're going to start looking at immediately. Obviously, the changes started today. That's something that was indicated by Jarmo a few weeks ago, and John Davidson reiterated it yesterday, I'm sure, both on the radio and television interviews that he was part of, president of hockey operations. JD indicated they're going to look at every avenue that's involved in this organization, and that is certainly something that will be addressed, I believe, really soon now that they've made the head coaching change here, and obviously a goaltending coach change. But it's something that I think the league's got to look at too. I've talked to a number of former NHL players and players that have significant interest in the NHL, be it turning into agents or being a part of a coaching staff or whatever. And the league's got to look at it as well, because you're looking at some of the top players and numerous players. Jackets aren't the only team to lose a great number of players. Colorado, the defending Stanley Cup champions, have lost key players here. Now they learn that Landeskog won't even play in the playoffs. The Montreal Canadiens are right there, player for player, with the Blue Jackets with the number of man games lost. And it's something that the Jackets are going to look at, but I can also assure you it's something the league is going to look at as well.
Yeah, and Dylan, some of these injuries the Blue Jackets have gone through this year are unavoidable. I mean, the labrum, just the way Werenski falls into the boards, it's a bad break, pardon the pun. Concussions are hard to, you can't really prevent that. These things are going to happen, but some of these other things, you wonder if they're going to, well, as Jeff just said, you don't wonder, they're going to. They're going to look at the overall body of work and, how these players are working. And I think we'll all agree with this, is the schedule has just become more brutal.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a lot of rest. At one point, remember when Brad Larson said that he had been trying to hold his team back and not expend energy in practice, and then he finally got so mad he was like, okay, screw that. We got to practice, and we got to practice hard. The games be damned. We just have to do it. The schedule doesn't help. It's not easy, but they got to look at everything.
Yeah, it's also been a weird last few years with the changing of the schedule and, pushing games up, pushing games back, yada, 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 having to reschedule games. It has been a weird last few years in that sense, so I'll be interested to see if the league does address some changes there, or at least talk about some changes there. But, Jeff Rimmer just referenced there the TV and radio interviews that those guys did, and I had the opportunity to speak with both JD and Yarmo each of the last 2 nights on the radio, and they both talked about this. I asked them, what are you guys planning on doing this offseason in terms of evaluation when it comes to some of the training stuff and the medical stuff? And, they said that they will look into it. Obviously, you have to based off of how bad everything went this season. But they also noted that a lot of the Blue Jackets injuries this year were just unfortunate and a little bit fluky. It wasn't a lot of soft tissue stuff. It wasn't like guys were straining groins or hamstrings or things like that. There were a couple of oblique injuries, but, Eric Goodbranson with a separated shoulder, all the guys that had this shoulder injuries
more shoulders I've ever seen.
essentially separated their shoulders, and they were all freak incidents in which that happened, and that's kind of how it goes with shoulders. But, we've said it time and time again. No stone is going to be left unturned. Like, you got to look into everything, right? But other teams are right there with the Blue Jackets. Jeff brought up the Montreal Canadiens. Like, imagine being a Canadiens fan this season. You lose the number 1 overall pick in Juraj Slafkovsky, and then you lose Cole Caulfield, who looked like he was on the way to, being right up there in the NHL goal leaders this season. He might have finished the year still leading Montreal in goals, or at least close to it, with Nick Suzuki at the top. He played about half the season and had 26 goals this year, and then was lost for the rest of the season. Like, those are 2 of your 3 most exciting players right there, and you're losing them for the entire year. Like, maybe something does have to change.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one thing, though. There's not going to be fewer games because it's money.
Right.
So,
There's going to be more games.
Probably.
We're talking about going to 84.
Yeah, so do you make this...
Cut down the preseason games. Cut down the preseason games. Start the season earlier and spread them out more.
Yes,
there you go.
You know what, Jeff? You think
like
that's...
Guys like Bob McElligott would love to see preseason games cut down.
That's what I was going to say to you. I was going to say, what do you care? You get out of those games. I got to do all those games.
Well, see, I'm thinking about you now.
You're a good guy. I don't care what these guys say. Hey, hey, Rimmer, I got one for you here. Bucknuts07 sent this tweet. It says, Yarmo sounding today that the Elvis experiment may be over. How do you go into next year with Elvis and Tarasov on one-way deals? That means no goalies picked up this summer. My guess is a buyout is coming. I don't see a buyout with Elvis. He still has 4 years left on his contract. But you and I have had conversations about this throughout the course of the year. How can you address that? Is that a contract you could get somebody to take? Again, the big question mark here is, can Tarasov play an entire season because he didn't this year? And then what do you do if he can't? But the Elvis thing, first and foremost, Jeff Rimmer, I know you love these contract things and these GM moves in your head. So what would you do with that?
Well, number one, he won't be bought out, at least from my perspective.
Right.
Not any inside knowledge or whatever. They're not going to buy him out. That's 4 years. That's quite a hefty price to pay. I think that, again, a lot of this is going to be dependent on what happens as far as the naming of a head coach and a goalie coach, and whether that they could resurrect his career. The other alternative, if I could put on my GM hat, and that is trade a bad contract for a bad contract. Another thing that you can do, even to make it a bigger deal, is the Jackets certainly have a lot of assets moving forward. In addition to a number of draft picks, they also have the ability with all the forwards and now all the defensemen that we had a chance to see this season. They've got some assets that they could move, and it could be a big package, and you're taking, obviously, a contract back. And it won't be the first time in the National Hockey League that you see players that have underperformed traded for another player that's underperformed, and especially now with the salary cap such as it is and so many teams up against the cap. So, yeah, they will find a solution. But I think ultimately, and first and foremost, they want to see who they bring in here as a coach, and ultimately who they bring in as a goalie coach, and can it work in resurrecting Elvis's career? Because I think we'll all agree, 2 years ago, we thought Elvis was ready to take off, and so did the management and coaching staff here. Well, evidently it didn't happen, and now they've got to go one way with tough love and bringing in the right people, or look the other way and perhaps try to make a trade.
Well, I know one thing, and I've said I'm still bullish on what Elvis Merzlikins can be, what Danil Tarasov can be. But if I'm Jarmo Kekalainen, I am not going into next season with that as my goaltending tandem without, at the very least, bringing in a veteran potentially, because between the injuries and the way that those guys were up and down performance-wise throughout the season, I don't think you can – I know they're both on one-way deals. I don't think that can be your only goalies, NHL goalies, going into next season. I think at the very least you have to find a veteran that can play some games. If you get into a situation where one of those guys gets hurt, or you go the route Jeff's talking about where you really explore the trade market.
Jeff Svoboda is the Jim Kramer of goaltending. He's bullish on this, by the way.
Stonks, baby, stonks.
And again,
well, the goaltending stonks right now are not soaring.
Yeah. The goaltending does stunk right now, actually.
It's the most important position on this hockey team moving forward, and they're going to have to somehow, some way, find a solution here for this upcoming season.
All right, one more thing before we go. Dale Bloom has sent this tweet, and it's literally 2 words: Andrew Brunette. Here's a guy that wound up as the head coach for the Florida Panthers last year when Joel Quenneville was relieved of his duties. Took that team to the President's Trophy, took them to the playoffs. They got swept by Tampa. He got swept out the door. He's now an assistant with the New Jersey Devils, who, coincidentally, have set franchise records in points and wins and all that stuff. So I guess it's very easy. We were talking about, do you recycle coaches or do you look for young coaches? Dylan Tyrer, I'll ask you. Andrew Brunette, where does that name when I say that, how does that resonate with you?
It's a little bit tricky for me because he walked into a pretty good situation in Florida, right? Like, Joel Quenneville's a very, very respected NHL head coach. He was there in Florida for a reason with a team that was very good. They had a lot of good players, a lot of offensive firepower. And then Andrew Brunette took over with everything that happened with Quenneville, and they had a good season, but they weren't good in the playoffs. Now he finds himself in another good situation in New Jersey where it's a group of guys that have been together for a little bit of time now. They're young superstars on that team. They've been trending in the right direction, and he's their assistant coach, right? It's not like he's the guy leading the charge. We'll see how they fare in the playoffs. Like, maybe my perception changes if they go far, and I'm like, wow, Andrew Brunette's learned something now, and, he's been part of a team that's had a lot of success like that, or maybe they don't show up in the first round and they get bounced, and I'm like, Andrew Brunette, I don't know about this guy. But as far as it goes with Andrew Brunette as a head coach, it's just a little bit iffy for me because, again, I go back to those veteran head coaches that have done it for a lot of years, and I feel like we're not that far removed from John Tortorella, so maybe you want to do a little bit something different. Like, Andrew Brunette's been there before, but he's not a Claude Julien. He's not a Peter Laviolette. He's not a Mike Babcock, the names that I brought up earlier. And, I just think you have to get it right this time, and I think you have a better chance of getting it right with one of those guys than a guy that is maybe a little bit of a retread. Like, he showed that he could be something, but maybe not.
Jeff Rimmer, have you talked to Lindy Ruff about him at all?
Talked to Lindy Ruff about
Brunette being on his staff. No, I just wondered.
No, I've not talked to him about it. I've talked to Tommy Fitzgerald about him, though.
Oh, okay.
Tommy Fitzgerald played with Brunette. They played together earlier in, I think it was Nashville, is where Tommy was at the time that Brunette was there. So before Brunette ended up in Minnesota and was a pretty important player there. And if memory serves me correct, Brunette also played under Jacques Lemaire in Minnesota. And that would be quite a learning experience. You want a hard-nosed coach, but a successful coach, there's a name. And while you guys are throwing out all these veteran names, Dylan, you just mentioned his name. Joel Quenneville is dying to get back into the National Hockey League. Does he end up with one of these jobs that open up? I'll tell you what, he's a very successful coach. He's a Stanley Cup champion a few times over. And I think that the National Hockey League's commissioner, Gary Bettman, may be ready now to allow him and take the suspension off and allow him to return to the NHL after a lengthy meeting in the NHL offices in New York. But there's another guy that could resurface somewhere, somehow, and he's a damn good coach.
Yep, I've thought about that name. Very, very good coach in the league, but you never know. Yeah. That's a tough situation.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, what you just said is the fact that he has to be cleared I think is why, his name comes up in my head, and then I'm like, I don't know. That's a lot of.
Well, for a situation like this one, that's a lot of baggage to come with it, I think.
He's going to get back in the league, guys.
Oh no, I agree. I agree with you on that. I do.
What you talking about Andrew Brett earlier though? Who was his goalie in the playoffs last year?
Sergei Bobrovsky.
Well, are you going to hold that against him?
Sheesh.
All right. We're going to wrap it up. Jeff Rimmer, final thoughts. You have anything?
Yeah, I was debating on the air last night with Jody as to who starts in that Florida-Boston series. He says you've got to keep going with the kid Lyon, who's got them there with a strong finish. I'm saying, no, you've got to go to Sergei Bobrovsky. That's a debate we can talk about the next time we all get together.
I have 10 million reasons that I back you on that, Jeff.
Hey, Jeff Rimmer, what do you do if you're the LA Kings? Who's starting in that series?
Well, Copley's had an outstanding season. I was looking at his numbers and Korpisalo's numbers. I'll tell you, I really feel bad for Korpisalo because, and Jeff alluded to it, Jeff Insider, that is. The fact that Korpisalo not only had a bad season last year, but he also struggled the season before. He has been dealing with that hip injury, and he tried to play through it. Had he gone ahead initially and had the surgery that he had last offseason, I think we might be sitting here talking about a whole different goaltending situation. Absolutely. And he, to his credit, he tried to play through that injury for 2 years and wanted to keep playing because he wanted to help the Blue Jackets. He's a terrific kid, and he's loved in that Blue Jacket dressing room. But, hey, I think he hurt himself, and he hurt the team by continuing to play. Now, as far as who starts in L.A., I tell you, I think you got to go with Korpisalo.
Not even debatable to me. You have to go with Korpisalo. The way he's played this year?
Yes, absolutely.
And the previous playoff experience he has, too, should factor in.
Yeah,
over Copley, absolutely.
Phoenix Copley's Phoenix Copley. Let's at the end of the day. Nothing against Phoenix Copley, but you could probably, if you're an outsider, you'd probably say the same
if you're a
thing
Kings fan, you're like, well, Jonas Korpisalo is bad with the Blue Jackets.
Yeah, you could say that too, but I think the way he's played the entire season. I mean, LA was 31st in the league in save percentage when they traded for Korpisalo. So let's
all right, we're way off the topic now. This is another.
Let's get back.
Closing
remarks.
Another show for another time. Yeah. Jeff, you have anything else to tell us about this coaching change? Anything else on your mind before we wrap it up?
I think you're going to see a few more changes, perhaps a general manager or two in the National Hockey League here in the days and the weeks to come. It all depends on how teams fare here in this first round. And if there's going to be upsets, because there always are, I think that we're in for a great offseason with a lot of hockey interest, a lot of hockey news, and a lot of hockey excitement with what goes on the ice during these Stanley Cup playoffs.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for joining us today. We enjoyed it, buddy.
I enjoyed it as well.
All right. Final thoughts from you guys. Jeff Svoboda. We'll go Jeff to Jeff.
It sounds like we just started a playoff preview show there. Maybe we need to do that one next.
I know. I don't, like, you guys are ready to take off. Like, what are we doing here? We're talking about one thing, and you guys want to go all day. Let's just wrap this up.
We've got players talking to us right next door. I got to go hear what some guys have to say. Come on.
Very good point. It's a pivotal day in the history of the Blue Jackets. They've made a line in the sand that they want to go a different direction. I think it's a huge hire for the future of Jarmo Kekalainen, for the future of this iteration of Blue Jackets, because they've built a good young team, they think, and I would agree, but you're starting to see the makings of these last couple of drafts come out in the wash, and it's starting to look pretty good in my opinion. They've got a lot of good young players. You need the right guy. What happens over the next couple months is going to be tremendously critical for 5 to 10 to maybe even 15 years of Blue Jackets hockey. So it's going to be pretty interesting to watch, in my opinion.
All right, Dylan?
One of, if not the biggest offseason in Blue Jackets franchise history for a number of reasons. You already have the opportunity to get the number 1 overall pick. On top of that, you're going to be hiring a new head coach. There are more moves that have to be made, obviously, for this team. Adding some veterans maybe to the forward group. I think definitely on defense. We already talked about the goaltending situation, so I'm really, really excited for it. But just want to say thanks to Brad Larson also, because I really, really respect Brad Larson, like him a lot. Don't want to make it sound like we're bagging on him too hard or anything like that, because that's kind of what we did at the beginning of this. But, he was really gracious, really nice, always answered any question that I had for him. So, the entire coaching staff, thanks to all those guys for being nice to me over the last couple of years here and being generous with their time.
No, I agree with that 100%. And, as I said, I got Brad Larson before each and every game. He was gracious with his time, gracious with his answers. I told him that yesterday after we did that final interview and shook hands. at the end of the season. He will be missed here. There's no doubt about it. And he will look good on Philadelphia's bench next to John Tortorella next year as an assistant. But anyway, because I do feel that he's going to wind up somewhere in the National Hockey League. He needs to. He's a good coach. And, again, I mentioned Manny Legacy earlier. I consider him a close personal friend, and he's been great to me. It's been a great experience being around him and learning from him and hearing all the old stories. I mean, nobody can tell you Dominic Hasek and Cujo stories like Manny Legacy can, and they're incredible. So I've enjoyed being around those guys. But, yes, it's obviously time for a change, and the Blue Jackets do have a huge decision. Jarmo Kekalainen has a huge decision. We'll see which way he goes. Will it be another young and up-and-coming coach, a guy like, a guy that they talked to last time around, Mike Vellucci, who's an assistant coach in Pittsburgh who won a Calder Cup with Charlotte in the American Hockey League. Could that be a name that resurfaces here? I mean, things in Pittsburgh, they're a little bit in turmoil there with the firing of Brian Burke and Ron Hextall, but Mike Sullivan's going to keep his job because he has a contract for a long time. And, so we'll see what happens. There are guys out there, and as Jeff Rimmer said, there are going to be more guys available as it goes along, and there are upsets in the playoffs. So, hey, but I want to thank you for joining us today here on this day after the season ends, pretty early on a Saturday morning to talk about this. And thanks to all of you that came on and had your input and asked your questions, made your comments. You guys are really what makes it go around for us, that we can sit here and get this kind of interest about this team even after a season like we just finished up last night. So thank you very much. Don't forget the draft lottery is coming up on May the 8th, and the Blue Jackets hope that they can pull off that number one pick. They still have a good chance of doing that. But after that night, we're going to find out exactly where they will pick in the draft that will take place the last week of June in Nashville. So between now and then, I'm sure we're going to be in touch. You can follow us all on Twitter, find us on Twitter, and you stay up to date with what's going on with the Blue Jackets at bluejackets.com, especially through the Jackets insider, Jeff Svoboda, because if he doesn't have it, nobody has it, right?
Sure. I'll make business cards and T-shirts.
That's what you should do.
And we've got lots of pre-draft coverage coming. So we're not going to be going anywhere. No. Lots of pre-draft coverage stuff. So if you're interested in learning about what the Blue Jackets could possibly do coming up in late June, I'll have all that stuff for you.
And if there's any prospect you haven't heard from in the system, Dylan will talk to them between now and the draft. I can guarantee you that. Because that's what he does.
I've literally talked to all of them.
I think. You have?
Yeah.
You're done?
I guess Mikhail Putia is the only guy that I haven't had the chance to yet.
Nice
run across
I'll
the hall.
go right. Well, yeah. I don't know. He might be back in Cleveland.
You can get him. Oh, yeah, that's right. They all got sent down, didn't they?
Yeah.
All right, get your cards. 2 hours. You'll get that.
I'll be in Cleveland at some point.
Once again, thanks to all of you for being with us. That's going to do it for this special Safelite Skate Space. The Blue Jackets changed their head coach. Brad Larson is no longer the head coach of the franchise. Manny Legacy is out as the goaltending coach. And now the search begins for those two positions and more as we go along. But for Dylan Tyrer and Jeff Svoboda and Jeff Rimmer, I'm Bob McElligott saying so long and thanks for listening.